Okay, today what we're focused on in teaching English across the disciplines is, again, in Unit 1, I'm giving you another piece of the big picture. And I think that a piece that we really need to talk about is pedagogical content knowledge. Easier to understand than it is to say, I think. And here's the piece that I'm emphasizing that you're probably not going to get in other courses and English language learners. So in other words, when we are thinking about the best ways to teach in a discipline, how does that need to change for English language learners? So, there's a graphic that's in your module, and if it's helpful, you might want to print it out and take a look at it during this lecture, or certainly just take a look at it afterwards. But it's kind of my idea of what we know about a discipline and what we know about how to teach a discipline, how that understanding needs to change a little bit for English language learners. So the place I want to begin is I want you to think about, have you, in your time of being a student, have you had a teacher that you were quite sure really, really understood the content, and yet they were not a good teacher? They did not make good choices. They did not lead you to understanding. They didn't find a way to make it engaging for you. Has that happened to you? It's happened for me, and it happened for me in high school in a math class. And I'm almost wondering if that isn't a pattern, and perhaps if you do have a teacher like that in your background, that for you too it was a math teacher. But just wondering if there's a connection there. The reason I bring it up is because that situation is actually an anomaly. That is the unusual situation. For most of us as teachers, the more that we understand our discipline, the more, and I've got content written here, but the more that we understand, whether it's science that we're teaching, or we're teaching the plays of Shakespeare, whatever it is, the more we understand that little corner of the universe, the deeper our understanding of how to give students traction in understanding it. Knowing which strategies tend to work for explaining that little corner of the world, helping students understand it, and which don't. Having a sense of which piece to tackle first and which pieces to hold off on until students kind of have their legs underneath them with that content. So what I'm trying to say is that math teacher that I had in high school, he's pretty unusual in terms of teachers. For most of us, the more we know, for example, the more we know about math, the better our choices are in how to teach math. And so what you have here is you have not something I created. This is by someone named Schulman, and I think they created it like in the 1980s or so. And it's the first time that someone was really talking about what we call PCK, or pedagogical content knowledge. When you get into the literature about about this, that's what everyone calls it, PCK. So now you're in the know. Now you know what it is that they're talking about. And what they're talking about is not what you know about your discipline or what you know about teaching, but they're talking about this wonderful sweet spot right here, which is what you know about how to teach in your discipline, the most effective ways to teach in your discipline. And that is this area right here. And in a way, if you think about it, what it's saying is that, just because you know a little bit about your content area doesn't necessarily mean that you really have a sense of how to teach that. It really has to be deep understanding. And so the deeper your understanding of content, the more these two circles are going to overlap. They're going to push together, and the bigger that sweet spot, the area of that sweet spot in terms of your effectiveness with students. So it's a really key idea. Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add my own interpretation of what we're going to accomplish in this class in terms of this diagram. So I think when we're working with English language learners, that we also are paying attention to culture. We have to think about the cultural backgrounds of our students and how they overlap or don't with the particular content on that particular day, that particular week, whatever that unit is. So having a sense of how that overlaps, having a sense of where those mismatches are, having a sense of how students' cultural perspectives might be a little bit different. And if you took the 489 Cultural and Linguistic Diversity in the Classroom, you've already heard me talk about my own background a little bit. I grew up on a farm in Indiana with, we were from many different places around the world, but very prevalent is a German heritage in my background, so much so that my father's family spoke German until recently. And so this, in some ways, shaped my cultural perspective. I can give you a quick example. In my family, very much German heritage, we believe that one way that a mother shows love for her family is by keeping the house very, very clean. And I remember when I was about 13, 14, and I was beginning to babysit for a nearby family. And I remember, I never said this to anyone, but I remember suspecting that the mother did not actually love her children, because every time I went over to babysit, the house was dirty. I would have said filthy at the time. Now my standards have changed a little bit, but at any rate, so you get a sense of how much culture kind of can change your perspective. Someone else would have looked at the way the mother interacted with the children and said, of course she loves them, she hugs them, or she kisses them, or she talks with them. And what I was paying attention to was how clean the house is. Of course, that's not my only perspective right now as an adult. But anyways, another way that culture really kind of shapes students' perspectives is the background experiences that they've had, and how those might look different from what is expressed in mainstream culture and expressed in our curriculum, which really buys into mainstream culture. So a quick example is if you have a student who's Punjabi, and so they've grown up in India for part of their life, or maybe they were born here in the U.S., but they're very much growing up in a family that participates in Punjabi Indian culture, then it's not that the student doesn't know what a wedding is, but the student's interpretation of what a wedding looks like, how long it lasts, how it's celebrated, who's there for how long, is going to be quite different. It's not going to be a man and a woman, and she's in a white dress and he's in a tux and she's holding flowers and there's a little girl walking in front of them with a flower basket. It's going to look a little bit more like Bollywood. That's my interpretation. But it's certainly going to be not just a 45-minute ceremony and a 2-hour reception. It might last for days. So one thing to keep in mind is students may come with incredibly rich background, cultural experiences, but they look enough different from what the mainstream culture expresses and what's being expressed in the discipline, that they might need a little help from us in seeing the connections, seeing how what they've experienced connects with what's being expressed. Another quick expression of culture, how it might be different for students, is they might very well know how to do something, but their knowing how to do it is coming from a different place. So maybe their mother too makes bread, but it's made in a very different way. Here's an example from my own experience. As you probably already know, I travel very regularly to Nicaragua. And I also, while I'm there, I often am doing qualitative research. So I'm going out and I'm often interviewing people or students or families. And there was a family that I wanted to interview, and the bus wouldn't get me there. So I asked at the school where I was staying, I asked if I could borrow the school truck. And they said, absolutely, but there's no gas in it. Well, I thought, this is a big problem, because we're 45 minutes away from the nearest city, and there's no gas stations between here and there. And so I just assumed it wouldn't work. And I said, oh, that's too bad, there's no gas. I would have liked to have borrowed the truck. And they said, well, of course you can borrow the truck. You just need to buy gasoline here in the village. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. How am I going to buy gas in a Nicaraguan village in which there's no gas station? How did I? Well, you take 2 pop bottles, 2 Coca-Cola bottles, and I'm not kidding, and you go to a house that's about 4 houses off of the main square in the town, and you knock on the door, and you give the woman who answers the number of Cordobas that you're willing to pay for these two Coca-Cola bottles to be filled with gas. And she brings out a container of gasoline and with her mouth begins the suction to get the gas to go into one of the pop bottles and then goes into the other one. So for a child who's growing up in that Nicaraguan village, they very much know how to get gas for a truck, but their knowing how that plays out is very different than us stopping at a Conoco station, right? So it's really important for us to, from the get-go, understand that for the most part, our students come to us with very, very rich background experiences, very, very rich cultural experiences. But it's very possible they just look different from the experiences that we had growing up and the experiences that our curriculum is assuming that students have had. And we certainly can't approach from a perspective in which we're discounting what it is that students bring. We need to celebrate that. Anything else about culture I want to mention? Besides those rich backgrounds that students bring, they might indeed be missing some assumed experiences. So it might be, for example, sometimes this is due to low SES, low socioeconomic status. It might be that the students sitting in front of us have not had the experiences that the textbook, that the discipline is assuming that they've had. And that could be simply because of not having had the money to experience it. Here's an example from right here in Spokane. The previous principal of the elementary in Spokane that has the lowest SES, it's in the lowest SES neighborhood in Spokane, and it has the lowest SES school population in Spokane. I was talking with the principal, the previous principal, and asking him, what kinds of things are you hoping for your students? And he said more money to pay for buses for field trips. And then what he said next really stopped me short. He said half of the students in the school had not even been to downtown Spokane, which was less than 2 miles from the school I was in. And so for us to assume in a discipline that students have had the experience of taking a bus or going on a plane or taking a long road trip or that kind of thing, it's very likely that those kinds of experiences are missing. So we need to be paying attention to the role that cultural perspective has, the role that the experiences, what they've looked like, and what experiences might actually be missing for our students. And so the more we understand about culture, the more we get the more of an overlapping piece with the content understanding, the pedagogical strategies that we're using. And so I think for English language learners, if we don't have this culture piece, we are missing a central piece of what we need to recognize about our students as K through 12 teachers. So what I want you to do is I want you to try this out a little bit, beginning to think about the different perspectives, the different interpretations, missing backgrounds, experiences that students might come to us with. And to try it out, what I've done is I've pulled together 4 children's books. I think 2 or 3 are very popular. You might even have read these books as a child yourself, or if you're a parent or an aunt or an uncle, you might have read these to a little one already. And I think at least one is from a different culture. All 4 of them, you have the URL to go to Amazon And I specifically chose these because they have the see inside or look inside function where you can actually turn the pages of the book and take a look at least at most of the book. And so I want you to take a look at those 4 children's books, and as you were looking through them, ask yourself, how might students missing certain experiences or having experiences that look quite different or having a different cultural perspective, how may they interpret this book or this page or this image in a different way than the author, the illustrator probably intended? And so I think that that will give you kind of your first toe in, before we get to the disciplines, of beginning to heighten your awareness of how people might have different interpretations of the very same information, the very same visual. So that's what I want you to do, the first thing I want you to do after you finish this lecture. Now there's another piece that goes down here, and I've made kind of an odd shaped, I don't actually have circles here, I'm not really good at drawing circles, but this one, as you probably would guess, is language. And so notice that there's the shared area now. And notice that it's gotten smaller. And that is due because when we are teaching English language learners, there's more responsibility on our shoulder. There's more elements that we're grappling with to really be effective teachers. And just so that doesn't scare you, you can do it. I know you can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. And so what we've got here is we've got culture, we just talked about, and now we've got language. We need to understand the language of the content. We need to understand what are the pedagogies we can use to teach that language in that content. And so just like with content and pedagogy, the more content you know, the more these 2 circles are going to overlap, and the bigger that sweet spot of understanding and effectiveness is going to be for you as a teacher. The same thing, the more we understand about culture, the more aware we are, the more awareness we have about language, and the more we understand about language, the more these are going to come together as well. And that sweet spot of effectiveness will become greater. That area will become greater. So what I want to talk to you about language is I want to talk to you about grammar, about vocabulary, and about discussion. Now, we've already talked very briefly in the last lecture about grammar. I mentioned grammar clusters. I mentioned how drastically different grammar can be from one discipline to another. And what we're going to do in this course to kind of heighten that awareness for us is you'll be taking a pre-quiz if you haven't already, and writing a pre-reflection if you haven't already. And you will also, at the end of the course, you will be doing the same in reverse, writing a post-reflection and taking a very similar quiz as well to kind of measure, assess your growth in that understanding. And so many of the different activities we'll be doing this quarter will really be giving you opportunities to develop that understanding a little bit more. So grammar is a huge part of this, but the 2 pieces I want to focus on here are vocabulary and discussion. So one thing that is key across whatever kind of content you are teaching is having an understanding of the pedagogy of teaching vocabulary. And of course, what we'll be doing is focusing on the pedagogy of teaching vocabulary in science or math or social studies or language arts. But in general, understanding how to help students move forward in vocabulary is key. So I'm going to throw out some really big ideas that no matter what the discipline is, they are true. And they're all based on what we found to be true for English language learners, or actually anyone trying to master another language and master the vocabulary. The first thing that we know is that students need multiple exposures. Students often ask me, well, how many times do they need to be exposed? Research disagrees with itself. There have been studies that say a minimum of 7 times, a minimum of 8 times, others as high as a minimum of 15 times. What I suspect is it has to do with the language learner, and it has to do with how meaningful those instances are. So it's very possible that for the same learner, they only need 3 exposures to a word and they've got it. A different word, maybe those exposures weren't quite as colorful, they weren't quite as meaningful, and so it takes 7 or 8. And maybe for another word, even after 20 times, they're still having a tough time remembering what that means. So we need multiple exposures. We need them to be as meaningful as possible. So the students are exposed, they're given evidence about the meaning, maybe because they hear it in something the teacher is saying, they see it in a page of text that otherwise they understand, they see it labeled with a picture from a picture glossary, or they have access to what the word means in their first language. So it's meaningful. And part of that meaningfulness is getting a different sense of how the vocabulary word is used. So they're not getting a one-dimensional sense, but they're getting kind of a real sense of how real people in this language use that vocabulary item. I know that for me, as I develop in Spanish, when there's a word that I know in one context and then I experience it in another, or I see that it's got a slightly different meaning, I love that. I feel like I'm getting a real sense of what that vocabulary item means and what it can do. An example, I first experienced the word campo, which means field, when I was taking a Spanish class, and there was a chapter on travel. And I know that the word was related to paisaje, landscape, like when people say, oh, what a beautiful landscape, that kind of thing. And I think that it was part of a cluster of words that I learned in connection with that. And then I experienced the word again when I was staying at a small village school in Nicaragua. And I was walking with someone, and we were talking, who was speaking to me in Spanish, and we were talking about the building of some houses. And the word campo came up again, and of course it had basically the same meaning. And then I got really excited when I was at a conference in my field teaching English to speakers of other languages, and the word was used, and I knew they certainly couldn't mean field, like field of sugarcane, or that kind of agrarian kind of field. And I was quite excited to see that just like we can talk about a field of hay, and we can say your field of study, you can do the same thing in Spanish with campo. So that's just a tiny example but I think it's really key to understand your students need that kind of exposure to language too, from different perspectives. Not just seeing it 7 times in their social studies chapter, but they need to hear it in a video. They need to see you using it. They need to be using it with a partner. And that brings me to the next thing that we can say is true for the teaching of vocabulary to English language learners, and that is they need not just to be exposed to it, which would lead to a passive understanding of the vocabulary item. They need to actually use it. They need to be writing, or more importantly, they need to be speaking it when they're doing a partner activity or group activity, that kind of thing. But they need to actually be using that vocabulary. Another thing that we know is that if you expose students to too many vocabulary items at one sitting, it will probably not be very effective learning. So what's the best number? I think most people would argue that 3 to 5 at the most, is the most vocabulary items that you want students to be exposed to. So to support that understanding of what we know about vocabulary and effective vocabulary teaching across those disciplines, I want you to do 2 things next to support yourself with this understanding. The first is I have a brief reading for you to take a look at, and then there is a video that I want you to watch, in which a teacher is basically demonstrating in her class how she tackles vocabulary and how she supports effective vocabulary learning for anyone in our class, including the English language learners. The next piece of language, and the last piece I want to tackle today, is the role of discussion. And discussion is key, and knowing the pedagogy of creating really powerful discussions is key for you no matter what discipline you're teaching, especially for your English language learners. There are more benefits for English language learners, and there are more negatives if you don't involve a lot of discussion in your class for English language learners. So the first thing that I want to emphasize with discussion is the more teacher talk you have in your class, no matter what it is you're teaching, the less your students will learn, especially the English language learners. The more student talk, the more discussion that you allow for in your classroom, the bigger the learning. So I know that a lot of new teachers, they really focus on them delivering the ideas to students. And I would suggest that instead of figuring this out in year 1 or year 2, that maybe you figure this out right now, that student discussion needs to be a huge part of every lesson that you carry out. You need to make that time so that students can learn. Another thing I want you to know about effective pedagogy of teaching discussion, especially with English language learners, it needs to be meaningful to the students. There's quite a big difference between saying to your class, okay everyone, take out your homework. I want you to check your answers with your seatmate. And if there's one that you disagree about, I want you to talk about it with each other and figure out what you think is likely, who has the right answer. So that's one kind of discussion, but that's not the kind of discussion I'm talking about. I'm talking about really meaningful discussion. So what that teacher could do instead is say to students, okay everyone, take out your homework, look over it for a moment, and then what we're going to do is we're going to have small group discussions in which I want you to take what you learned about from your carrying out your homework last night. I want you to think about whether or not the law that you were reading about, whether it should be passed or whether it shouldn't be passed. I want you to commit to an answer and try to convince your group of your answer if they disagree with you. So look at that. Both teachers could say, yes, I built in discussion from my students today, but one is not very meaningful. The students are carrying out simply a task that the teacher has asked them to. What the second task hopefully does, the second discussion task, it gives students an entryway into the content. It gives them a way to bring what they think, what they care about into the content. So it kind of builds kind of an on-ramp to that freeway for them. And so those are very different kinds of discussions. And one way that you can, I think, kind of shape your way of thinking about this is to think about what are the big questions that this content really is leading us to ask. Or if I were switching TV channels, talk shows, 60 Minutes, that kind of thing. If this were to appear, if this content were leading to one of those shows, what would they be discussing? Where can people agree or disagree with each other? And that's where you want the discussions to be. Those big questions that really matter to the students. Find a way to harness what they care about and connect them with that. And one way that I think about that is make sure that they're actually using language to get to a product, whether that's an answer, a decision, an opinion, that really matters to them. Make sure they're not just practicing language, they're actually using language. Where I want you to go to reinforce this part is there's a PowerPoint actually online. There's no audio that goes with it. It's simply the slides. They're pretty meaty. And you don't need to read all of the slides. Please note I only point you to certain slides. And the slides are looking at the role of discussion in helping students really, especially English language learners, really develop their vocabulary. And the first slides begin by noting a discussion with interviews with teachers in a certain discipline. I think it's social studies, but it really doesn't matter, in which the teachers were asked, do you think discussion is important to help students move forward in their understanding, especially vocabulary development? And all of them said yes. And then 3 months later, the researcher shows up in their classrooms to see what they're doing. And it becomes clear in the PowerPoint, not one of them was really carrying out discussion. So I think that underscores a really good place for us to begin. Yes, I know you know right now discussion is important. And I just gave you, I hope, a really good resounding argument of why you need to have real, meaningful, useful discussions in your classroom, including your beginner ELLs. And yet, we're very likely not to do it. So go ahead and read that research, the PowerPoint slides that I pointed out there that talk to you about why discussion matters and how teachers do it effectively. And then there's a short video that occurs right after in which a teacher is talking about how she uses discussion and how she uses discussion to move along vocabulary development and how to make sure students are actually moving forward in their discussions, in their language development. So I hope that that's really useful to you. So again, where do I want you to go after kind of understanding how I think pedagogical content knowledge needs these extra 2 elements when you're working with English language learners? Go ahead and do that activity, looking at children's books, 4 children's books, and notice yourself becoming aware of how cultural perspective could shape the interpretation of those books. And then I also want you to take a look at the reading about vocabulary and the video that follows it, and taking a look at the reading and the PowerPoints about discussion, and then the video that goes with that as well. So after all that, I'll see you in the discussion. Meet you there.